The Gilded Age was prosperous due in part to its freedom. If you were an American man with a vision, you didn't have to rely on a loan from an FDIC insured banking conglomerate. Your local bank in the Midwest, Northeast, or South, which had ostensibly known your family for years, was happy to invest in a mining or railroad prospect. There was no income tax, and property taxes were low. Banks knew their customers, and every dollar was on the gold standard, not risky crypto or lunatic NFTs. There was no Federal Reserve until 1913, when J.P. Morgan and his cronies tightened the reins on who or what could become rich in the United States. Stateside manufacturing was incredibly strong in the Gilded Age, allowing inventions to be turned into products without the risk of sharing trade secrets with Chinese or Indian groups. In this Gilded Age, we see the unbridled ambition of women such as Alva Vanderbilt, who you can learn about in the Gilded Age playlist on this channel. In the HBO series The Gilded Age, she seems to be echoed in character Bertha Russell, while her shy, docile daughter Gladys seems to echo Consuelo Vanderbilt. One cannot blame Alva, who saw a great Anglo-American nobility alliance or a European royalty American wealth alliance, which could have prevented war in a similar vein as the intermarrying of Queen Victoria's descendants did for decades. Here is Consuelo Vanderbilt herself, the former Duchess of Marlborough, in her 1952 autobiography, The Glitter and the Gold. In this piece, we will learn of her debutante days in Europe and New York, and her sacrifice of her fiancé Winthrop Rutherford, known as Mr. X, in exchange for millions of dollars of Vanderbilt Railroad stock offered by her mother. Consuelo highlights what would become England's lost houses, where British nobility refused to educate themselves, and so lost their children to needless wars, failed to fight death and inheritance taxes, lost peerage MPs, and hundreds of English country houses disappeared after World War I, all of which continue to impact British culture today. Here is Consuelo Vanderbilt's A Debutante of the 90s. I had reached an age where the continual disagreements between my parents became a matter of deep concern to me. I was tensely susceptible to their differences, and each new quarrel awoke responding echoes that tore at my loyalties. Profoundly unhappy in my home life, I awaited the rupture which I felt could not be long delayed. Divorce in those days was considered shocking, and because of its novelty would create a dire scandal. But of this I knew nothing and cared still less. The immediate cause of my happiness was to be found in the constant scenes that so deeply wounded my father and harried my mother beyond control, scenes that embittered the sensitive years of my girlhood and made of marriage a horrible mockery. It was in such atmosphere of dread and uncertainty our last and longest yachting expedition was undertaken in my 17th year. We left New York in November 1893, with India as our destination. The party included my parents, my brother Harold, a doctor, a governess, and the 3 men friends who were our constant companions. Willie, being at school, remained at home. My mother, claiming my governess gave sufficient trouble, refused to have another woman on board. Our way to Bombay lay through the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, calling only at Tunis and Egypt. We spent 2 days in Cairo, while the yacht passed through the Suez Canal and coaled at Suez. The harbor of Bombay was a welcome sight after so long a voyage, But when we started to cross India in a private sleeping car attached to a regular train, we realized what discomfort in a train could amount to. At every station, angry natives seeking transportation tried noisily to force their way into our bedrooms, which opened directly onto the station platforms. Luckily, the doors were locked, but the din was formidable, and in the night, those angry mobs were threatening. No one slept, and the next day we continued our journey in the comparative luxury and seclusion of a private train. Thus we crossed India, stopping at Ahmedabad, Jaipur, Delhi, Benares, Lucknow, and Agra. Accompanying my parents, I did all the sights in tourist fashion, and spent a night of lurid memories in Lucknow. I read a vivid description of the gallant defense of its English garrison during the Indian Mutiny, and how they were finally overcome and massacred by Indian troops. In my hotel bedroom, which was accessible to any marauder, the horrors of that massacre assumed nightmare proportions. Hotels at that time were small hostels, 1 story high, built to accommodate commercial travelers. The front of the rooms gave onto a court, while the back looked out on an open drain. Fortunately, most of our nights were spent on the train, which was backed onto a siding. Even then we knew little comfort, for it was difficult to secure bath water, and the food was incredibly nasty. We lived on tea, toast, and marmalade. It was wonderful to find all the luxuries of home on the yacht Valiant, which had come round India from Bombay and lay anchored in the Hooghly. My parents spent a week as guests of the Viceroy and Lady Lansdowne at Government House, Calcutta. My mother, whose habit it was to impose her views rather than to invite discussion, already on occasion revealed the hopes she nourished for my brilliant future, and her admiration for the British way of life was apparent, as was her desire to place me in an aristocratic setting. These intentions, I am sure, crystallized during her visit at Government House. In the Viceroy and Lady Lansdowne she found exemplified the qualities she admired, which the prerogatives of a privileged life had but enhanced. In conversations with her hostess, who was Marlborough's aunt, the possibility of my marriage to him may have been discussed. It is certain it was then her ambitions took definite shape, for she confessed to me years later she had decided to marry me either to Marlborough or to Lord Lansdowne's heir. While we were in Calcutta, I went to spend a day with Lady Lansdowne's younger daughter at a place the Viceroy had on the river. She was just my age and was to become my cousin by marriage, since both Lady Lansdowne and Lady Blandford, my future mother-in-law, were daughters of the Duke of Abercorn, Old Magnificent, as he was dubbed while Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. She and I compared the books we were reading, and I was surprised to find how scanty was her knowledge. Little time or trouble was spent on the education of English girls. It was still customary for them to have, sometimes inherited from a previous generation, what Lady Mary Wortley Montagu humorously described as a good homespun governess. They read Miss Young's History of Greece, but Virgil, Gibbon, Hallam, and Green were all equally unknown to them. I pitied the limited outlook given by so restricted an education, and wondered what chance a girl so brought up had against a boy with a public school and college background. Later on, I was to find English girls suffered many handicaps, and I came to realize it was considered fitting that their interests should be sacrificed to the more important prospects of the heir. It was with no regrets I left India. It seemed to me a cruel country. Women had so little part either in its history, its life, or its religion. Their lives were spent in purdah, in petty squabbles and intrigues, which sometimes culminated in ugly tragedies. How glorious in comparison was Greece, where women as goddesses inspired the arts! How transcendent the Acropolis, with its amphitheater of mountains in the distance, the sea nearby, and the little theater where the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides were first heard. We went this spring in Paris. I can still see the view over the Tuileries gardens from our windows, still enjoy our walks under the flowering chestnuts of the Champs-Élysées, and our drives in the Bois de Boulogne in our carriage and pair. Every day there were visits to museums and churches and lectures, but the classical matinees at the Theatre François were my greatest pleasure. At times I have wondered whether it was anticipation of my future that caused my mother to arrange for me to have lessons in elocution with an actress from so classic a school, or whether she already realized any daughter of hers would find causes to champion. Whatever her motive, the lessons produced a voice that carried. On Sundays, my governess and I would go to St. Sulpice and sit with Widor, the celebrated organist. How deeply moving was that Mass in its spiritual ascendancy of an inviolate faith! There was in that beautiful church, in that vast assembly, a dedication such as had animated the Crusades, that sanctified the participant. In the Paris of my youth there were no motor cars. One used to stroll along the boulevards or sit and watch the passing crowd. The little open Victoria, in which it so delighted the Princess of Wales to drive incognito, was, with the boats that plied the Seine, the pleasantest conveyance. The Rue de la Paix was the fashionable shopping centre, and names of the great dressmakers, Worth, Doucet, Roof, were painted on small doors, admitting one to modest shops. Inside, the array of lovely dresses, expensive furs, and diaphanous lingerie fairly took one's breath away. I longed to be allowed to choose my dresses, but my mother had her own views, which unfortunately did not coincide with mine. For my first ball at the Duc de Gramont's in the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, where I made my debut at a party given for the Duchess's eldest daughter, I wore a white tulle dress made by Worth. It touched the ground with a full skirt, as was the fashion in those days, and it had a tightly laced bodice around my 18-inch waist. My hair was piled high in curls, and a narrow ribbon was tied around my long and slender neck. I had no jewels, and wore gloves that came almost to my shoulders. It is difficult for a girl of the present day to visualize a white ball, as those dances given for debutantes were then called. A bal blanc had to live up to its name of purity and innocence. It could not inspire the mild flirtations of a pink ball, where young married women were included. The men who attended them, no doubt with the intention of selecting a future spouse, were expected to behave with circumspection. There was no opportunity for conversation. A debutante was invited to dance, and once the dance was over, she was escorted back to her mom. Rows of chaperones lined the walls, discussing the merits of their charges. The young girls stood diffidently beside them. The terror of not being asked to dance, the humiliation of being a wallflower, ruined the pleasures of a ball for those who were ill-favored. With the politeness inherent in the French, a galaxy of partners presented their respects to me, and I was soon at ease and happy. Curiously enough, my second husband, Jacques Balsan, who was present, told his mother the following day, "I met at the ball last night the girl I would like to marry." It was 27 years later his wish came true. We spent the whole of May and June in Paris, and I had 5 proposals of marriage. When I say I had, I mean my mother informed me 5 men asked for my hand, as the French saying goes, but Jacques was not among them. She had, as a matter of course, refused them, since she considered none of them sufficiently exalted. There was only one, a German prince, whose cause I was allowed to consider. Prince Francis Joseph was the youngest of the 4 handsome Battenberg princes. I met Prince Francis Joseph at an evening party given by Madame de Portelet in her house close to the Madeleine. She was a typical grande dame, and in her salons were to be found the beau monde of Paris. I felt lost as I entered that brilliant throng of statesmen, diplomats, and elegant women, but my hostess with her charm called me to her and put me at ease. I sensed by the way she drew me out her interest was not inspired purely by kindness to a little debutante, and I wondered what lay behind it. Later, in the course of the evening, while I was with the prince, I saw my mother engrossed in conversation with our hostess. They observed us with interest. Instinct suggested and made me fearful of some deep-laid plot. I was grateful for the distraction offered by the Comte Louis de Turin's witty comments on those present. He was a diplomat of the old school. It was, he told me, the fashion of great ladies to aspire to political power through protégés whose ambitions they fostered. It was common knowledge that intrigues were there to displease Prince Ferdinand of Saxe-Coburg, who, though elected ruler of Bulgaria a few years before by the great powers against the wishes of Russia, had not yet been accorded general recognition. Pointing to Prince Francis Joseph, the Count said it was rumored that at least one of the powers would be willing to elect him king in Ferdinand's stead, and he appeared to be assured of success if provided with the necessary financial backing. The stage seemed set for a political intrigue, and my hostess's ambition to place her protégé on a throne showed signs of succeeding. I think for a moment my mother's intentions to marry me to an English duke faltered. A royal crown glittered more brightly than a coronet. So the prince continued his courtship unhindered, unfolding his ambitions to my apprehensive ears. It seemed I was to exchange one bondage for another. Such a marriage could mean only unhappiness. Separated from my family and friends, living in a provincial capital, iron-bound in a strict etiquette with a man whose views were those of a prejudiced German princeling, how could I reconcile myself to such a life? Only a great love could make such a marriage possible, and I felt aversion rather than attraction for the dapper man of the world, for whom I realized I was only a means to an end. My mother, on second thought, decided to adhere to her former intentions and raised no objections when I confessed my feelings. So nothing more was heard of the project. Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria, backed by the great powers, assumed the title of Tsar, and Prince Francis Joseph of Battenberg's royal aspirations later became reconciled in a minor role to his marriage to a Montenegrin princess. Soon after this we left Paris to spend the summer in England at a rented house near Marlborough on the Thames. Having begun a divorce suit against my father, my mother wished to await its conclusion abroad, and had invited Mrs. William J., with her daughters, who were my friends, to visit us. My parents definitely parted that spring in Paris. I felt relief the sinister gloom of their relationship would no longer encompass me, but I did not realize how irrevocably I would be cut off from a father I loved, nor how completely my mother would dominate me from then on. We first went to London, and settled in the fashionable Brown's Hotel, a dingy structure in a narrow street. The rooms were frosty, in the true English sense, and contained a bewildering medley of the rubbish of centuries. Rigid armchairs had lace, comfortless couches stood stiffly against the wall, footstools and what-nots impeded one's progress, and a black grate held black coal at an impossible angle. I thought with longing of our gay and handsome suite at the Hotel Continental in Paris, and of the lovely view over the Tuileries Gardens to the Seine. Our carriages and horses, the imposing French coachman, and the no less distinguished English footman preceded us, and our first outing was a visit to Lady Paget, one of my mother's oldest friends. She was born Minnie Stevens of New York, and when my godmother, Consuelo, Duchess of Manchester, Lady Randolph Churchill, and Mrs. Cavendish Bentinck represented the American element of the smart coterie known as the Prince of Wales set. Lady Paget was considered handsome. To me, with her quick wit and worldly standards, she was Becky Sharp incarnate. She was married to a tall, handsome officer who, in time and for no apparent other reason, became a general. She lived at 35 Belgrave Square. She received us with a mixture of the affection due to an old friend and the condescension that seemed to infect the habitués of the inner circles of London society. Once greetings were exchanged, I realized with a sense of acute discomfort I was being critically appraised by a pair of hard green eyes. The simple dress I was wearing, my shyness and diffidence, which in France were regarded as natural in a debutante, appeared to awaken her ridicule. My lack of beauty, for I was still in the ugly duckling stage, made me painfully sensitive to criticism. If I am to bring her out, she told my mother, she must be able to compete, at least as far as clothes are concerned, with far better looking girls. It was useless to demur. I was only 17. Tulle must give way to satin, the baby décolletage to a more generous display of neck and arms, naivete to sophistication. Lady Paget was adamant. It was at a dinner party at her house soon after that I met the Duke of Marlborough. My hostess placed the Duke on her right and had put me next to him, a rather unnecessary public avowal of her intentions. He seemed to me very young, although 6 years my senior, and I thought him good-looking and intelligent. He had a small, aristocratic face, with a large nose and rather prominent blue eyes. His hands, which he used in a fastidious manner, were well-shaped, and he seemed very proud of them. By that time the London season was over, and the festivities and balls of June and July petered out into the dust and heat of August. Society had gone its different ways to Scotland to do a cure or simply to country houses. We went to our house on the Thames accompanied by Mrs. J. and her daughters, who were younger than I. My brother Willie joined us. With Miss Harper, my governess, and my brother Harold, we were a pleasant little party. Being the eldest and hard put to finish my studies, I worked a considerable part of the day. There were occasional breaks in our routine, such as the day my mother, posing as an English chatelaine, gave a party for the village children. To our discomfort, they complained the American ice cream gave them tummy aches, and clamored for hot tea, which we had not provided. Occasionally we had guests. Among them I remember particularly Paul Deschanel, a good-looking and cultured Frenchman. He used to read French poetry to my mother, but one day, breaking off a couplet, he asked her permission to pay me his court. He told her of his ambitions, and announced he would be President of the French Republic. He was at this time a member of the Chamber of Deputies, of which he would soon become president. There were no more readings of French poetry after so indiscreet a disclosure of his ambitions, and the next day Monsieur Deschanel departed, taking a tearful farewell of me. Years later, as President of the French Republic, Deschanel paid an official visit to England, and as fate strangely decreed, I was selected as his partner in the state quadrille at the court ball at Buckingham Palace. The Lord Chamberlain informed me he relied upon me to steer my partner through the intricate figures. We were dancing opposite King George, who expected his aristocracy to avoid false steps in the quadrille as well as in other matters. I could not help smiling at the president's bewilderment when, confronted by a tall lady glittering in jewels, he recognized his small philosophical rose he had once wished to marry. During the dance he managed to whisper, "Did your mother tell you I had made up my mind one day to be President of the French Republic?" And I answered truthfully, "Yes, but only after your departure." His end was sad, for after several undignified exhibitions of folly, he threw himself out of a railway train in a tunnel and died. That summer I received 2 or 3 other proposals from uninteresting Englishmen, which I found slightly disillusioning. They were so evidently dictated by a desire for my dowry, a reflection that was inclined to dispel whatever thoughts of romance might come my way. In the early autumn of the year 1894, we returned to America. I looked forward to being in my own country, and to coming out in New York society with feelings of pleasure. The few balls of Paris and London awakened a zest for more, and I was anxious to see something of my friends from whom I had been separated for many months. It was with relief I realized the dangers of a foreign alliance were at least for a time being in abeyance, and my mother's ambitions appeared to have waned, since that one dinner with the Duke of Marlborough remained our only meeting. We settled at 660 Fifth Avenue, from which my father had temporarily been banished. Society, not yet hardened to divorce, was inclined to take sides. During the following months I suffered a perpetual denial of friendships, since my mother resented my seeing anyone whose loyalties were not completely hers. I had to render a strict account of the few parties I was allowed to attend without her, and if I danced too often with a partner, he immediately became the butt of her displeasure. She knew how to make people look ridiculous, and did not spare her sarcasm about those to whom I was attracted, reserving special darts for an older man, who, by his astounding looks, his distinction and charm, gained a marked ascendancy in my affections. The following March, on my 18th birthday, a succession of floral offerings arrived in staggering profusion. It was then the custom to send American Beauty roses to the object of one's affections, and when I opened a small box and found a perfect rose alone on its green foliage, I instinctively knew who had seen it, although no name was attached. Later that day I received the only proposal of marriage I wished to accept. We had gone to Riverside Drive to bicycle, which was at that time a fashionable amusement, and Mr. X and I managed to outdistance the rest. It was a most hurried proposal, for my mother and the others were not far behind. As they strained to reach us, he pressed me to agree to a secret engagement, for I was leaving for Europe the next day. He added he would follow me, but I must not tell my mother, since she would most certainly withhold her consent to our engagement. On my return to America we might plan an elopement. Alas for those hurried promises! I have never succeeded in hiding my feelings, and my mother must have guessed the cause of my new radiance. She laid her plans with forethought and skill, and during the 5 months of our stay in Europe I never laid eyes on Mr. X, nor did I hear from him. Later I learned he followed us to Paris, but had been refused admittance when he called. His letters had been confiscated. My own, though they were few, no doubt suffered the same fate. When one is young and unhappy, the sun shines in vain, and one feels as if cheated of one's birthright. I knew my mother resented my evident misery, and her complaints about what she jokingly termed my martyrdom did not improve our relations. Like an automaton, I tried on the clothes she ordered for me. Visits to museums and churches were varied by concerts and lectures. I went to a few of those deadly debutante balls which I no longer cared for, and danced with men who had no interest for me. Then we moved to London, where events began to move more rapidly, and I felt I was being steered into a vortex that was to engulf me. One ball stands out clearly because of the beauty of the hostess and of her surroundings. It was given by the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland at Stafford House. The young Duchess was a glittering apparition in her silver dress and diamonds as she stood at the top of the great staircase receiving her guests. Marlborough, whom I had not seen since the dinner at Lady Paget's the previous year, claimed several dancers. We were but a short time in England, and a visit to Blenheim Palace was the outstanding event. At that time Marlborough lived there alone. His 2 unmarried sisters sometimes stayed with him, but his mother, Lady Blandford, was seldom invited. She had, after many years of unhappiness with Marlborough's father, finally divorced him, and he contracted a second marriage with Mrs. Hammersley, an American widow, whose wealth had been freely spent installing central heating and electric light at Blenheim. Blenheim, which had also been the home of Lady Caroline Lamb, also impressed one by its immense size and by the beauty of its situation and surroundings. It has a stately grandeur. We entered the park through a stone arch. A porter in livery, carrying a long wand surmounted by a silver knob, from which hung a red cord and tassel, stood at attention, and the great house loomed in the distance. At the right of us and below lay an ornamental lake spanned by a monumental bridge. We turned into a fine avenue of elms, and passed through another arch leading into a court around which were disposed audit rooms, laundries, a porter's lodge, and various offices. On its southern facade it was flanked by hothouses, which formerly housed a collection of Titian. The gallery was kept locked, since ladies were not allowed to view the pictures, and great was their delight when it was destroyed by fire. Passing through still yet another stone arch, we drove into the central court, surrounded by the house. The doors opened onto an immense hall with a domed ceiling. It was so high I had to crane my neck to see the painting of the Grand Duke, dressed in a Roman toga, driving a chariot. He was surrounded by clouds, and I realized he was hurrying through celestial spheres, no doubt to join Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Even Napoleon, I thought, could not have imagined a finer apotheosis. The architect Van Brugge unfortunately forgot to provide space for the monumental staircase such a house required, and one had to climb a long and narrow flight with an ugly handrail. We went into the great saloon, where again we viewed the first Duke and his household in wall frescoes. Here there were two impressive mantelpieces, and in front of one a tea-table was set. In due course Marlborough, accompanied by his sisters, Lady Lillian and Lady Nora Spencer-Churchill, joined us. Lillian, a pretty blonde a few years my senior, immediately won my heart by her simple, unaffected kindness. 2 or 3 young men completed a party which seemed lost in so big a house. As I looked about, I saw drawing rooms stretching in vistas on either side of the saloon, on the west towards the long library, and on the east to the private apartments. We spent the evening listening to the Duke's organist, a famous musician from Birmingham. The following day, Sunday, my host showed me his estate. We drove to outlying villages where old women and children curtsied and men touched their caps as we passed. The country round Blenheim is rural, with ploughed fields and stone fences. The lovely old churches delighted me. Each cottage had its small garden gay with flowers. I realized I had come to an old world with ancient traditions, and the villagers were still proud of their duke and of their allegiance to his family. They earned little, but were cared for when sick. There were as yet no stump orators to inform them of better conditions. Politicians were liberal or conservative, which meant in either case much of the same to the tiller of the soil. That Marlborough was ambitious I gathered from his talk. He should be proud of his position and estates seemed natural. But did he recognize his obligations? I don't know what Marlborough thought of me, except I was quite different from the sophisticated girls who wished to become his duchess. My remarks appeared to amuse him, but whether he considered them witty or naive I never knew, except much later, after our separation, he said on the occasion of some trivial catastrophe, "Consuelo must be laughing at this. She has such a sense of humor." Luckily for me, I have always been able to laugh even at my own discomfort. It was that afternoon he must have made up his mind to marry me and give up the girl he loved, as he told me so tragically soon after our marriage. for to live at Blenheim in the pomp and circumstance he considered essential needed money, and a sense of duty to his family and to his traditions indicated sacrifice of personal desires. When I left Blenheim after that weekend, I firmly decided I would not marry Marlborough. And homeward bound, I dreamt of life in my own country with my Mr. X. It would, I knew, entail a struggle, but I meant to force the issue with my mother. I did not relish the thought, but my happiness was at stake. My mother invited Marlborough to visit us in Newport some time in September, so I barely had 6 weeks to make my plans. I was nervous and worried, not knowing when or where I could get in touch with the man to whom I considered myself engaged. On reaching Newport, my life became that of a prisoner, with my mother and my governess as wardens. I was never out of their sight. Friends called, but were told I was not at home. Locked behind those high walls, the porter had orders not to let me out unaccompanied. I had no chance of getting any word to my fiancé. Brought up to obey, I was helpless, under my mother's total domination. Despairing of ever seeing him, I succumbed to despondency. When at a ball we met, we had one short dance before my mother dragged me away, but it was enough to reassure me his feelings towards me had not changed. Driving home, my mother observed an ominous silence, but when we reached the house, she told me to follow her to her room. Thinking it best no longer to dissemble, I told her I meant to marry X, adding I considered I had a right to choose my own husband. These words, the bravest I ever uttered, brought down a frightful storm of protest. I suffered every searing reproach, heard every possible invective hurled at the man I loved. I was informed of his numerous flirtations, of his well-known love for a married woman, of his desire to marry an heiress. My mother even declared he would have no children, and there was madness in his family. I had no answer to these accusations, but in my silence she must have read how obstinately I clung to my choice. In a final appeal to my feelings, she argued her decision to select a husband for me was founded on considerations I was too young and inexperienced to appreciate. Though rent by so emotional a plea, I still maintained my right to lead the life I wished. It was perhaps my unexpected resistance, or the mere fact no one had ever stood up to her, that made her say she would not hesitate to shoot a man whom she considered would ruin my life. We reached a stage where arguments were futile, and I left her then in the cold dawn of morning, feeling as if all my youth drained away. No one came near me, and the morning dragged on. I could not seek counsel with X, for there was no telephone. I could not write, for the servants had orders to bring my letters to my mother. Neither could I get past the porter at the gate. The house was full of ominous rumors. I heard my mother was ill and in her bed. A doctor had been sent for. My governess, usually so calm, was harassed. The suspense was becoming unbearable. There was no one I could consult. To appeal to my father, who was away at sea, and knew nothing of my mother's schemes, would, I knew, only involve him in a hopeless struggle against impossible odds, and further stimulate my mother's anger. Later that day, Mrs. J., who was my mother's intimate friend, and staying with us at the time, came to talk to me. Condemning my behavior, she informed me my mother had had a heart attack brought about by my callous indifference to her feelings. She confirmed my mother's intentions of never consenting to my plans for marriage, and her resolve to shoot X should I decide to run away with him. I asked her if I could see my mother, and whether in her opinion she would ever relent. I still remember the terrible answer. Your mother will never relent, and I warn you there will be a catastrophe if you persist. The doctor said another scene may easily bring on a heart attack, and he will not be responsible for the result. You can ask the doctor yourself if you do not believe me. Still under the strain of the painful scene with my mother, still seeing her frightening rage, it seemed to me she might indeed easily suffer a stroke, or a heart attack if further provoked. In utter misery I asked Mrs. J. to let X know I could not marry him. How sad were those summer days of disgrace and unhappiness, my mother turned away from me, my father out of reach, my brothers engrossed in their personal pleasures, Willie cruising in his boat, Harold too young to mix himself in my problems. My friends wearied of being rebuffed, they no longer called, and with an ingrained reticence I kept my worries to myself. How gratefully then I looked to my governess, Miss Harper, for consolation and advice. How wisely she spoke of the future awaiting me in her country, of the opportunities for usefulness and social service I would find there, of the happiness a life lived for others can bring. And in such gentle appeals to my better nature, she slowly swung me from contemplations of a purely personal nature to higher idealism. Brought up to obey, I surrendered more easily to my mother's dictates than others. It seemed to me impossible further to risk her displeasure, implying as it did persecution of the man I loved and danger to herself, the doctor indicated. History records many marriages of convenience. Even in my day, they were still in vogue in Europe, where the interests of the two contracting parties were considered to outweigh the wishes of the bride, so that what to many of my compatriots may appear an unwarranted prerogative was to my mother but a reasonable decision. Thus disciplined and prepared, I found with Marlborough's arrival a sudden change of scene. Determined to outdo all previous entertainments, my mother gave a ball described in contemporary newspapers as the most beautiful fete ever seen in Newport. The favors for the cotillion, which she selected herself in Paris, consisted of old French etchings, fans, mirrors, watch cases, and sashes of ribbons, all of the Louis XIV period. Lanterns, which were a facsimile of Marble House, and bagpipes which really squeaked, added an amusing note. Each favor was marked with a medallion representing Marble House. The young Duke of Marlborough, the papers continued, stood by Mrs. J. in the grand salon and viewed the pretty women with interest. I went to dinners and balls, escorted by Marlborough, chaperoned by my mother. In the harbor, on one of those sumptuous yachts millionaires then owned, John Jacob Astor and his beautiful wife, now Lady Ribblesdale, entertained us. A cruise with the Pembroke Jones was declined, as Marlborough claimed he was too bad a sailor. My father's yacht, the Valiant, was away in other waters, and the man I longed to see had withdrawn from so gay a scene. How leisurely were our pleasures! In the mornings, with my mother, we drove to the casino in a sociable, a carriage so called for the easy comfort it provided for conversation. Dressed in one of the elaborate batistes my mother bought for me in Paris, with Marlborough opposite in flannels and the traditional sailor hat, we proceeded in state down Bellevue Avenue. At the casino we met the beau monde and its belles, young Mrs. J. Astor, Miss Grace Wilson, later to marry my cousin Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the two lovely Blight girls. But to my mind the most beautiful of all, with a classic perfection of face and form, was Louise Morris, who, later married to Henry Clews, bequeathed that beauty to her daughter, the Duchess of Argyle. How charming they all were, in their picture hats and organdies, so incompatible with comfort, but so becoming. Returning to Marble House, perhaps for a luncheon party, we would often see Oliver H.B. Belmont, a noted whip, bowl swiftly by on his coach, skillfully guiding his blue-blooded leaders, rocking him and hurling him. Oliver Belmont was a man of taste. He had at that time a unique stable of carriage horses. In order to be closer to them, he built over his stables near Bellevue Avenue an apartment where he lived with his books and a collection of equestrian knights in medieval armor. It was in the comparative quiet of an evening at home that Marlborough proposed to me in the Gothic room, whose atmosphere was so tended to sacrifice. There was no need for sentiment. I was content with his pious hope he would make me a good husband, and I ran up to my mother with word of our engagement. There was no time for thought or regrets. The next day the news was out, and a few days later Marlborough departed to see something of a country he announced he would never revisit. There was in his sarcastic comments on all things American and arrogance that inclined me to view his decision with approval. When I broke the news of our engagement to my brothers, Harold observed, "He is only marrying you for your money." And with this last slap to my pride, I burst into tears. It was obvious they would have preferred me to marry an American compatriot, but unable to speak of the emotional turmoil I so recently experienced, I could not enlighten them. An immense distance now separated me from them, for I had grown years older. In October we returned to New York to a new house my mother had taken since her divorce had become final. It was on 72nd Street and then demolished. November 5th was fixed for our wedding, but it was changed to the 6th, when Marlborough said that November 5th was Guy Fawkes Day, and it would not be suitable for him to be married on a day that an attempt had been made to blow up the House of Lords. I could not understand why Guy Fawkes' attempt to blow up Parliament almost 3 centuries before should affect the date of our marriage, but this was only the first of a series of, to me, snobbish prejudices, inspired by a point of view opposed to my own. Ordering my trousseau, always an exciting event in a girl's life, proved of slight interest, since I had very little to say about it, my mother not troubling to consult the taste she claimed I did not possess. The marriage settlements gave rise to considerable discussion. An English solicitor crossed the seas with the declared intention of profiting the illustrious family he had been engaged to serve. Finally, the settlements were apportioned in equal shares at my request. The strain my engagement imposed on my feelings was further intensified by material considerations. However, with my engagement, vigilance relaxed, and my correspondence was no longer subject to scrutiny, a circumstance that permitted a host of proposals to reach me. They were penned by would-be knights, anxious to prevent the unhappiness so unromantic a marriage seemed to hold in store. Rendered skeptical by recent experience, I viewed these offers with little enthusiasm. As the wedding approached, there came presents. My mother forbade me to receive any gifts from my Vanderbilt relations, and I felt hurt and pained when I was made to return them without excuse or thanks. My grandmother was the only Vanderbilt whom I was allowed to visit, and the only one invited to my wedding, but she naturally refused to come to a ceremony from which her entire family was excluded. My 8 bridesmaids had been selected by my mother from among her friends for her own reasons. They were Edith Morton, Evelyn Burden, Marie Winthrop, Catherine Dwyer, Elsa Bronson, May Golette, Julia Jay, and Daisy Post. They wore long dresses of white satin with blue sashes, and their big picture hats were most becoming. The arrival of my wedding dress brought the realization my mother ordered it while we were still in Paris, so sure had she been of the success of her plans. Mine was the first international marriage that had taken place for some time. It created great interest, and every incident of my engagement was publicized. Reporters called incessantly. Since little news was given out, accounts were fabricated. I read to my stupefaction that my garters had gold clasps studded with diamonds, and wondered how I should live down such vulgarities. I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone. No one came near me. A footman posted at the door of my apartment, and not even my governess was admitted. Like an automaton, I donned the lovely lingerie with its real lace and the white silk stockings and shoes. My maid helped me into the beautiful dress, its tiers of Brussels lace cascading over white satin. It had a high collar and long, tight sleeves. The court train, embroidered with seed pearls and silver, fell from my shoulders in folds of billowing whiteness. My maid fitted the tulle veil to my head with a wreath of orange blossoms. It fell over my face to my knees. A bouquet of orchids that was to come from Blenheim did not arrive in time. I felt cold and numb as I went down to meet my father and the bridesmaids who were waiting for me. My mother decreed my father should accompany me to the church to give me away. After that he was to disappear. We were 20 minutes late, for my eyes, swollen with tears, required copious sponging before I could face the curious stares that always greet a bride. To my mother, who preceded us to the church, the wait appeared interminable, and she wondered whether at the last moment her plans were dashed. There were the usual crowds of curious sightseers on Fifth Avenue. When we reached St. Thomas, I saw an endless aisle with clusters of white flowers, and at the altar stood the Bishop of New York and the Bishop of Long Island. So many eyes pried my defenses, I was thankful for the veil that covered my face. I remembered to press my father's arm gently to slow his step. Marlborough, with the best man, his cousin Ivor Guest, were waiting for us. The usual hymns glorifying perfect love were sung, and when I glanced at my husband shyly, I saw his eyes were fixed in space. As we came out of the church, the crowd surged towards us, and women tried to snatch flowers from my bouquet. There were spasmodic cheers and less friendly sallies. At the luncheon which followed at our house, the British ambassador, Lord Pauncefote, made a charming speech, to which Marlborough responded fittingly. The best man toasted the bridesmaids, but the ushers were not called upon to demonstrate their goodwill in speeches. Driving away from my home, I looked back. My mother was at the window. She was hiding behind the curtain, but I saw she was in tears. And yet I thought she attained the goal she set herself. She experienced the satisfactions wealth can confer. She ensconced me in the niche she so early assigned me, and she is now free to let ambition give way to a gentler passion. In seeking a divorce, she persuaded my father, much against his will, to give her the grounds a decree in New York State requires, a code in which the subtle charges of mental cruelty cannot be stretched to a complaisant elasticity. I was happy to think in her marriage to Oliver H.P. Belmont she would find happiness. I did not then know how tragically short their married life would be.